Before we begin our chat, panelists, can you please tell us who you are and what you do? Celine, how about you go first? Alphabetically.
Sure. Okay, hi, I'm Celine. I am a Baltimore-based illustrator and cartoonist. My 2019 comic, The Man Who Came Down the Attic Stairs, is set in post-war Europe and focuses on issues of obstetric misogyny, postpartum psychosis, and domestic violence. My current long-form project, Hestia, is an erotic gothic romance and hopefully launch in the spring of 2022.
Hello, I'm Ned Barnett. I am a cartoonist who focuses primarily on the early 20th century, particularly around the First World War. My 2019 book today was a historical graphic memoir that focused on my research using the archives at Oxford University as I was conducting research about T.E. Lawrence, who I am working on a long graphic biography of.
Hi, I'm Otava Heikkilä. I am from Tampere, Finland. I'm a comic artist who focuses on queer adult comics. I'm currently wrapping up a series called Gardo for Iron Circus Comics, which is about a vampire court. It's an adult erotica. My main interest is prehistory, especially the Upper Paleolithic and the Neolithic, which is where my comic Shattered Sphere is set. I'm interested in looking far back and dispelling this idea of brutish and dumb cave dwellers, and instead interpreting our distant past with dignity and humanity.
Okay, hey, I'm Safiya. I'm an illustrator and graphic novelist. I'm very passionate about fashion history, specifically in North Africa, and its intersection with identity. I'm currently working on a graphic novel pitch that's set in Algeria during the Ottoman Empire, but in the meantime, I'm doing a lot of illustration work centered around those themes. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So let's just dive in immediately. Okay, cool. So to start, can you tell us how much research a part of your creative process overall, and how has it benefited as a storyteller and as an artist?
I guess I'm going first, right? So,
Sure.
All my projects start out with a feeling I want to explore. So in Attic Stairs, I needed to articulate what was happening to me in my marriage and my fears about motherhood in that context. But I didn't want to draw a memoir. My research about twilight sleep and reading Marilyn French's work about white middle-class motherhood and marriage just prior to the feminist movement gave me a framework within which to locate my experiences, create a narrative that stood on its own. The project like Hestia, I'm working with a much wider chasm of experience between myself and my subject, so there's significantly more research to do. I'm lucky that people have been writing about the ancient Greek experience for centuries. A lot of fascinating areas of interest are available for me to pursue. The problem as I see it is that if my research isn't entirely in service towards the emotional story I'm trying to tell, then I've lost my focus and I'm at risk of boring my readers with all the facts that I just want to show off in order to justify the effort that I put into digging them up. So ultimately, there comes the point where I walk away from my research and give myself permission to take as much artistic license as I think will serve my story.
That's excellent. Ned?
Research is part of my own creative process in terms of I like to create biographies and work that focuses on specific. So for my own work, I do a lot of research to find out what happened, how it happened, and when possible, perspectives from the other side of things. Not always the easiest to find due to lovely things like colonialism, and that is deeply sarcastic. So I do find myself digging into research, primarily a lot of visual research, and looking for photographers and creators that are not like the typical Europeans. And I have a lovely research library that has a small amount of that, and I'm very happy about it.
Oh man, that's so great. And Otava, what do you have to say about doing research, especially with prehistory, where like things are like much more difficult to find in museums and such?
Yeah, hold on. This is 2 questions in one. Which shall I answer? How is research central to my work, or
Yes.
how to research? Yeah. I mean, with research, I would say also like it's really central to my work. It's like I usually start researching, or like I usually start hyper focusing on a thing like many months or even like years before it kind of takes shape of a specific story. And like once I have like the focus, it narrows down to researching more specific stuff for it. But yeah, I think sorry, I lost track of the question.
Oh no, it's all right. Would you like to add anything more, or should we move on?
I'll come back to the prehistoric question when it feels.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right, no problem.
Okay.
Safiya?
Yes. So for me, research is at least like a third of my process. I think I take a lot of time just kind of gathering, because I do a lot of North African inspired art and stories, and already that's a challenge, finding good sources, credible sources too. So what I do is I take a lot of, I look at photographies, I look at paintings, I try to, gather all of that stuff, and I take a lot of time to gather that before I start working on my projects, just to start like getting into it, I guess, getting into the aesthetics and the atmosphere. And then after that, I'll start kind of like synthesizing everything and focusing what I want to do for the story that I'm thinking of. And like, for example, the current pitch that I'm working on set during the Ottoman period. It started with a photography that I saw of 2 women during the Ottoman period in Algeria. And then I gathered more photos, I gathered more information about that time period, and everything kind of came together for me. That's pretty much how I do it, even with illustrations or stories. Unfortunately, with subjects that aren't European, it's harder to find, texts that aren't completely warped with like colonial themes and the white gaze. So what I do is pretty much I try to take everything at a grain of salt, and I end up with a story. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's like, yeah, it's always challenging to create something like based on like and to find that it's so much messier and so much more complicated than you first thought. So I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper in this, and I wanted to know, like, do you have any like specific techniques when you're doing your research? Like, do you do the research before you make the first word or sketch, or is it like an ongoing process during the creation of writing? And how long does this process take for you?
So I have kind of a, oh, Jesus Christ. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So like, because I'm working in erotic romance, I have a different set of goals. It's sort of parameters. I'm not trying to represent history exactly the way it was. I'm trying to turn on my readers and make them feel joy. So my work is much more speculative than it otherwise could be. So for me, I started out just asking myself what I'm interested in, what kind of stories I want to tell, what kind of characters I want to draw, and then from there, I start doing my research and kind of just give myself a really long leash. So like, I'm interested in marriage customs, gender roles, agrarian lifestyles, and disability studies. So about the Tibetan custom of one woman marrying a group of brothers to avoid breaking up a family's estate, and several videos about visually impaired people using echolocation to gain a greater degree of independence. And then, well, I didn't long, but I've been working on my research, the research part of it, for about 4 years now. And since I started, I've gone on to all kinds of really interesting research tangents that have developed my ideas. And so like I use Sci-Hub to read academic papers, and I buy books from university presses. I travel a lot, so anytime I go abroad, I try to do a lot of studies. Locations that might be visually similar to the ones I'm drawing. I haven't been to Greece too. Yeah, so that's kind of it.
It's fascinating. Ned?
So my research, it starts as I'm coming up with the idea. In terms of doing the book, I've been interested in T.E. Lawrence for a decade now, and I first read a biography of him the summer before I went to grad school, and since then have sort of been thinking like, how will I do something related to this story? And when I got into comics, that was sort of like, oh, this is a thing I want to use to share this story. And given that comics is such a visual medium, at that point, my research went from not just being reading histories and reading his letters and reading like that, to doing visual research in terms of looking at the era, not just of like British military stuff, but also looking at what people dressed like in Syria at the turn of the 20th century, and visual representations, both Western and on the ground indigenous representations, so that I would work towards getting out of a Orientalist presentation. Also includes reading books like Orientalism and thinking about mindset and such. And so it is an ongoing process as I write the book and illustrate, and as I figure out how I want to visually represent things. I've sort of put that project on hold a little bit so that I can do a bit more visual and historical research. For other projects that I work on, I've had people say, hey, I would like you to write a book about X. And so it's the case that I sit down and I read biographies about X or historical events, like about this historical event, and sort of find in that what the angle is that I want to take, where for me is the interesting story.
Right. So.
Okay, so yeah, I think when I get like obsessed with a specific theme, I kind of like I hyper focus on it on like several months or several years. Well, not probably not several years, but when it I am sorry, I lost track of thoughts. Can you ask the question from me again?
Oh, it's know more about your research process, and if you have any like specific techniques that you use when you are doing your research, and how long the process is.
Okay, yeah. So usually when I'm more locked into the project, I use like the torchlight method, which is like where I build the story kind of aims the beam of light. So that is the direction where I try to focus the research. Like for Shattered Sphere, which was my short story about the chance meeting in the Neolithic 10,000 years ago. I focused on reading materials about like late Neolithic, and but for like stories like my upcoming bigger comic, which is a fantasy, it's much more like like casting a wider net of like I'm currently reading because I'm creating the whole world, which is not based on like our real world. I'm reading up on like the Finnic cultures of like Western Russia and Finland and Estonia in like the Iron Ages onwards, and the Scandinavia Viking Age, as well as like ancient Mesopotamia and like the ancient Rome, and like kind of the start of like how civilizations are built, which is kind of relevant to the comic. Yeah.
All right, Safiya?
Yes. So for me, as I already said, it's very hard to do, credible research using, like academic sources, museums. So usually, if I had to break down my research process, it would be I come up with like a small story in my head, not like just literally just one moment between two characters. And then I'll look at pictures set during that era. For me right now, Ottoman Algeria. And then after I've like gathered visual sources, because like just like Ned talked about, it's important to also, because we do comics and illustration, that you have the visual research as well. It's a huge part of my process. And after I'm done with that, then I'll jump to like written sources if I can find them. Regardless though, even if it is images or text-based research, I have to be very critical of what I'm reading, because it's insane the amount of disinformation that there is, even using like museums, for example. I was looking at like accessories. No, actually, I was looking at weapons in Algeria, and I found a photo of a weapon. It's called a flisa. It's a Kabyle sword that's very specific to a certain tribe in a certain area of Algeria. And I found images for it in a British museum, and I was like, ooh, high quality image. That's great. I look, and they mislabeled it as Moroccan and like a whole other era. And I'm like, yeah, the name, literally the name Fisa comes from the tribe it's from, which is Iflisien, which is a tribe in Algeria. It's, the word is like right there, but and I've found that often in different like museums, like it's often British museums, but also French. I don't know why British museums even have our artifacts. They've never colonized us, but anyways, yeah, so that's also a problem. My one tip that I have that's not very like, it's not very, it's not like foul proof, but I usually will like research. I'll go on Google.dz, which is for Algeria, like the Google of the country you're looking for, using a VPN for that country if you have VPN. That always helps like filter through the Orientalist crap, for me at least, with Algerian sources.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Yeah, like a friend told me that tip, and it saves me, because really, like, I filtered all of the like world building for D&D, like tribal Pinterest boards. Anytime I do research for my stuff, that's always what comes up first, and it doesn't when you Google with the Algerian Google, so that's great. But in parallel of all of that, like Ned mentioned again, reading activist work or reading like actual like Orientalism, very important. I recommend it for everyone. It's very important, because you don't know. It's not always flagrant, especially if you're doing research of domestic life. Like in Algeria, doing domestic life research, you'll come across the most like violent stuff, most misogynistic stuff, when you just want to know like how did they live, and it's always harem stuff. Yeah, So the one tip I have is be critical and never trust British museums. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, amen. But this is actually like a really great segue point into the next question, which is like, do you all like have any tips for like an artist or writer who is doing research for their comics for the first time, and it's not just for historical comics, right, but for comics of like any genre whatsoever?
Gosh, really, my one main tip is if you're using Sci-Hub, which if people don't know what that is a like open source for non-academics to access academic papers and journals without having to pay or have like a university account. It's wonderful. I use it a lot. If you try to load too many papers at once, they will block you. Unfortunately, after I downloaded like 30 papers at once about masculinity studies, don't do that. But otherwise, that's kind of my only tip.
So one thing that I found is along with being able to either, I'm fortunate enough, my day job is at a university, so I try to use as many of the resources that I can. But if you do not work at a university, that you want to do some research and there's a paper you want to read and the academic who wrote it is alive, just email them or like strike up a like friendship with them on Twitter, and that'll often like open up a lot of doors. I found out about the event that Dreamers of the Day was written about was a exhibition at Oxford University, T. Lawrence's life, and he grew up in Oxford, and so I found out about that on Twitter, and the library organizing it and was like, I'm coming from the States to attend this, like, can you put me in touch with people? And he was like, well, I can put you in touch with the people Bodleian Library, so you can go in and look in the archives. And that was really fantastic. I didn't realize that as a non-academic, I could go and do that. And a lot of universities, like Oxford, you can just walk, you have to email them ahead of time and let them know you're coming and what stuff you want. But if there's something you want, you can email them. Places like MIT is similar. Anyone can walk in and use their resources. But it depends on the university and such. And that's been really great. I'm not a trained historian. I am an English major. And being able to use those resources is fantastic. And also make friends with other people who are interested in what you're interested in, because either they may have some research or materials or be able to recommend you stuff.
Definitely, I have a lot of classics fans who help me out with that.
Mm-hmm. I love sharing my resources and asking people for help. And then also of your work, I have had conversations with people who were reading some documents related to Lawrence's career in the Royal Air Force, and they willfully misread some of them and didn't look as to what folder these documents, these archival materials were in. And it was just like, you need to think more, ask questions, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, my advice was going to be much more practice centric, but like, it's okay if your first work is badly researched, and that's good because you have to start somewhere. You have to doing all parts of doing comics is practicing the muscle, and like doing research is the same. Like my first comic, Let's Ricardo, is set in the 18th century, but it is it is a very first attempt at it. It is very like aesthetics first and like oh, that's a cool idea, I want to add that, and then doing research kind of much later for it. But that's fine, like we have to start somewhere, and like every time we do one piece and we continue to the next one, we gain a lot of like, we learn better what resources to use, how to use them, and we get better at it. So just like train the muscle of how to implement what you're reading into your work, and like go for it.
Yeah, and like not everyone's aim is to be perfectly like historically accurate. Like in my case, there's 0 archives on lesbians in Algeria during the Ottoman period. I just make it up in a way that makes sense with the stuff I've read and the culture I live. But yeah, otherwise there's no real way to research that. And yeah, another tip is like, don't, for me, when you can be specific, don't fall into the like, oh, this region of the world, let's just smash them all together. Like I feel like if you can do it well, that works, but sometimes it just falls into that like weird Orientalist like mishmash that I don't particularly care for personally. And try to build your work or your research not like based off other stuff, like derivative stuff. If you like, I'm talking about specifically North Africa. I don't know about others, but for me, any work that's been inspired by North Africa has usually gotten it wrong and has gotten it like very like, it's obvious it's been built off other work that was vaguely inspired by North Africa. Like I don't want to offend anyone with this, but I have a thing with Star Wars and the way they've handled our culture and Dune and stuff like this. It's very obvious when the research has been very like, yeah. So try to, yeah, I'll then too. Try to focus your research on real archives or primary sources, whatever you want, before you go look at other works, especially by white authors. Yeah.
All right. Oh man, and this is like floating really near to something that I want to talk about, which is that popular ideas and misconceptions of history are usually propagated by popular storytelling. So, like for example, the general public is more likely to associate ancient Greece and Rome with like white statues, or medieval Europe with like brown and potatoes. I mean, brown as in like mud, all right, which are both like historically incorrect visual memes that began as like socially constructed Anglo-centric myth making, and this meme like continues to persist in Hollywood movies, in TV, and all visual culture. So, as visual storytellers, we have the power to like correct or even complicate these like ideas about the past. And as far as I'm aware, all 5 of us here are advocates for like responsible and thoughtful representation, whether it's by like giving life to historical and cultural details, or depicting marginalized identities and experiences with respect and sensibility. So in light of all this, since like I wanted to ask you all, like, how does exploring like the visuals of material culture and art history and sexuality and queer history and all that, how does that allow us to like reclaim our marginalizations and oppose stereotypes and empower our place in the world?
So, of course, I am not marginalized in very many ways. So I have to be really careful about my role as a storyteller and my subject. I have a lot of stuff to consider with a project like Hestia. You know, yeah, I don't want to fall into a lot of the myth ancient Greece. Like, that's definitely something I think about, but I think that'll be a little easier to tackle than the fact that I'm trying to tell the story of a blind woman in a visual medium, and I myself am not blind. So I am aware that I'm a complete outsider to this identity, and from the start I knew that nothing would get published until I submitted the completed story pitch to blind readers and continue to work with them throughout work on the comic to make sure they feel like this is a story that is for them just as much as anybody else. And, you know, I'd rather have to start completely over after receiving their feedback than to spend the next 10 years drawing a comic that does nothing but exploit the people I'm claiming to represent. So, like, you know, that's my nightmare. And no comic project is worth that kind of violence, that kind of harm. So yeah, that's my input basically.
Similarly to Celine, I am not super marginalized. I mean, I am a gay trans man, but above all else, I am a white person who lives in New England, and that is something that I try to keep in mind with the stories that I tell, and especially with doing the Lawrence of Arabia story, I am working on a story about an interlude, and how do I make sure that I respect the history of the people in the Middle East, and making sure that when I tell this story that it is the focus of it is on Lawrence, and I do want to make sure that I get the representation aspects correct. So doing visual research, and also when I get to the point, making sure that I sensitivity readers, making sure that I bring on historians from different parts of the world to make sure that I'm doing a good, respectful job, and ultimately realizing that I'm telling the story of a white interloper, and making sure that I don't fall into Orientalist traps, and being very cognizant of this is the time period I'm working in, and this is the person that I'm following. Making sure that in this story that I do critique him, and play off of the David Lean movie grand gesture, like grand heroic moment, and I don't really see him as a heroic figure, and writing more of a man who was in the wrong place, the wrong time, made a lot of bad choices, and making that really the focus of telling his story.
Yeah, I think, like, I am also a white trans person, so take me with a grain of salt, but like, I think, like, as marginalized people, we are kind of drawn to history as a subject, or at least personally, I'm drawn to like history because it's about like treating people who are like no longer here, or whose voices won't be heard, like with dignity. Like, I think we have like this tendency to dehumanize the past, like either as like especially like prehistoric past, that we don't like have anything except like graves and stone tools and things left. I think we have like this tendency to like dehumanize them as like either like lower and dumber creatures, or like in the other direction as like these noble savages, like put them on a pedestal. And I think like these kind of both feed into this mindset of like separating them as something completely different from us. But like if you're looking at like, I don't know, 200,000 years ago, I think now it's like 4,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, that we're like looking at like modern humans who are like neurologically, physically, and emotionally the same as we are. I think it's important to kind of like nourish that connection, like keep us associating and empathizing with them. And I think like as queer people, that feels more logical maybe. But I think also like comic is a very good medium for this because you don't need words to put messages across. Like a lot of what you're showing to your audience is like purely visual, and it like bypasses this kind of like conscious level. So you can feed quite a lot of like radical thoughts more subconsciously to the reader.
Yeah.
Yeah, in my case, I think the topics that I explore, the period in time and the geographical area has been used for creative capital by, white creators for so long, throughout history, that I think it's super important. For me, I do it because I'm passionate about it, but I also realize that telling a story about that time period with these visuals, as a person from that lived reality and culture, I think it's just very important, and I think I will always prioritize that point of view over any other. Like when I see other creators from my community, a lot of us, I think that it also resonates with a lot of people from different cultures, where you don't feel like you have a claim over those stories anymore almost, which is there's a weird sense of imposter syndrome where you're not sure that you can even tell these stories properly. But the way I see it, our cultures have been used as like visual, like little spiciness to add to your stories, to give a sense of world building that it shouldn't even matter at this point. The way our cultures have been butchered, especially like in North Africa, there's a lot of like a lot of sci-fi and fantasy that borrows heavily from our cultures. I wouldn't even call it borrowing at some point. Like I would just call it ripping off. And I think it's important to just kind of reclaim that. And I think I have a better point of view and a more interesting point of view about my own history and my own culture than like some randos who just want to use it for world building without any like, it's just visuals, not any understanding of the culture, not any, yeah. Pretty much.
Yeah, like I totally feel the same way as a creator from the global south, where we don't see a lot of like representations of our culture or of our history in mainstream media, and even in our own like local media and such. It just doesn't feel like important or pertinent, But yeah, I do think that like just showing up and actually like doing the work of like making something that is specific, that is thoughtful, that is like interrogative and challenging and radical and interesting, that is actually really mind bending and life changing. A lot of people out there, not just for creatives but for readers as well. And on that note, we are actually like experiencing a renaissance right now of graphic novels that explore a wide range of historical topics, but most of them are educational and targeted towards the middle grade audience. So as creators of historical fiction and nonfiction for an adult audience, what are your thoughts on this like phenomenon?
Gosh. Well, okay. I think it's wonderful that like when I was a kid, when I was a so-called middle grade reader, there was nothing in terms of comics to read, like almost nothing. There was Calvin and Hobbes, and The Far Side, Gary Larson. So I think kids today are gonna take for granted so much of the comics culture that we're starting to have now in the US. And as much as I kind of get frustrated with the, in my opinion, overemphasis on middle grade readers and YA, I know that those kids are going to grow up thinking that comics are for them, and they are going to want to read adult comics when they become adults. And that's something we had in the States before. Other countries have it. And it's just starting to happen now. Like, we are on the forefront of that in America. It is so exciting. And those readers are going to be so hungry. Stories for adults, stories that challenge them, and I think we really have to encourage that and talk to publishers to try and figure out new ways of getting these books into their hands and continuing that readership into, like, across all stages of life, that comics are really truly for everyone.
I agree 100% with what Celine. My own perspective, as when I was in the middle grade YA, I was not a kid who read much middle grade or YA, even though there was more at that period. I was the sort of the dawn of the YA fantasy genre, was my youth, but I was always drawn to historical fiction and nonfiction and books that had the main characters were in their late 20s or early 30s. I did not want to be a teenager. And I think there's definitely when I write my books, I write them for what I wanted to read. In the case of Lawrence, I'm writing about some really heavy topics, including war and sexual assault and mental illness, and I don't want to have to come up with a way of sanitizing these topics in order for them to be presentable to children. And I want people who would decide to pick up this book to know that there are difficult subject matter being included, and that it's going to be dealt with maturely, and dealt with emotionally responsibly. And I'm excited for the dawning adult graphic novels, because then there will be a place for these, and not having to worry about being like, oh, my character's in his late 30s, early 40s, I can't get this book published, or my subject matter in this case, is exciting. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same as Ned. Like, when I was a kid age reading, or supposed to be reading kid comics, I was reading like Blade of the Immortal, Berserk, Regis Loisel, Black Sad, like all these comics that were not supposed to be read by kids. And look how it turned out. Anyway, I don't myself do comics for kids. I am so grateful for like my colleagues who are making like some amazing, interesting comics for kids right now. And like, I think like you said, we're like definitely living like this renaissance of comics right now, because like indie publishing and like especially online publishing is like just flourishing right now. And I'm so excited to see where we're going to be in like 10 years, when like kids who are like 17, 18 right now and drawing like the most amazing first attempts at their web comics, they're going to be making like amazing work in 10 years.
Yeah.
With all the resources they have and like all the friends they're making right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up like in a French-speaking area, so I didn't have my pick of comics. I was always into historical fiction, and it was just a logical next step for me to, as someone who loved art, to create comics. I did as a kid. Yeah, like you said, like I'm excited to see these kids that grew up with all of these like resources, like they have iPads, they have their little tablets, they have their means to publish online. I'm excited to see the conclusion to that, because obviously the market is going to have to adapt to that, and that will mean that when they grow up, the comics that are going to come out should also be geared towards them. So yeah, I'm excited for that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I just hope that publishers are listening and they are actually like doing the work of like accepting the pitches now, because graphic novels take a long time to make. You know, so right. So yeah, basically this is, come on, more graphic novels for kids and adults, for everybody, please.
Yes.
Yes, totally. But in the meantime, while we are waiting for traditional publishers to keep up, right now, a lot of interesting and genre-defying comics are being published online and through like niche indie publishers, usually delving into like really or marginalized topics or histories and like complicated topics. So this is going to be the last question for our panel. I wanted to know, how has publishing online or through a niche publisher allowed you to pursue like the freedom of like making your own work and maintaining your artistic / cultural / historical integrity?
So just about every experience I've had with a publisher has been horrendous, and it really burned me out for many years on going that route. A lot of publishers have expressed intense interest in Hestia, even though like it doesn't exist yet. But my strategy is to only self-publish and support myself on Patreon or whatever other platform, and sell the story directly to my readers, because that way I won't actually know how much the story is worth. I do that because the publisher could lowball. And you know, if I'm making $20,000 a month on like some of these other erotic artist creators, publisher like has no like to take advantage of me. So I really recommend that other comic artists consider before they jump into bed with any publisher.
For my work, I am primarily self-published at this point. And it's been fantastic because I've been able to just make the work that I want to make. And when I do talk to publishers, I can go, hey, look, I made this thing and I made it myself. Here it is. And it shows that I've been able to do the research, do the work, and I've been able to sell it. And I have a very, very niche topic within a very, very, very niche topic. So.
Yeah, I mean, same. Like my whole identity as a comic creator is like completely tied to like self-publishing and indie publishing. Like I don't even know what my comics would look like if I had gone through like traditional publishing route first. And like I think, as with others, I like a lot of what I do. It is unmarketable basically. Like I focus on like adult erotica and adult topics, not necessarily always the same thing. And as well as like queer and trans subjects in my work. But yeah, I mean, self-publishing, indie publishing, crucial lifeline, and flourishing right now, so good.
Yeah, for me, I'm not published yet, my own stories, but in my case, as an illustrator mainly, I think that like being able to post my art online, reach people with that, in a place that like we don't have a very big industry where I am of like art. I think it's been great, and it's giving me like a lot of opportunities to reach, you know, a lot of people. And yeah, like I think online has, if I didn't have my accounts to post online, I would not be where I am. So I owe my life to it. Yeah.
All right. So according to the clock, we have like 15 seconds. So yeah, our time is up. Thank you so much for like coming here and having this conversation with me, and like thank you to like everyone who has taken the time out of their Sunday job on us. And I'm not sure if you have time squeezed in this, but
we do not have time.
We do not have time.
We do not have time. Yeah, sorry.
All right. It's okay. So I just float off that. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
This was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.